Good day. We are watching Learn Extra Lessons for Grade 11, and today's topic that we'll be discussing is frameworks for development. We will be going through key concepts, important definitions, and explanations that you need to know in terms of this section, and we will also look at different questions that you can expect to find and how to answer those specific questions. So if we start today, we look at our key concepts. And our key concepts are things like the following. Okay, so it says, what factors affect development? We're looking at this particular topic, and we look at things such as access to resources, the energy, history, trade imbalances, okay, population growth, education and training, natural resource limitations, and environmental degradation. So as you can see, there's a lot of topics that we are going to be discussing in terms of the frameworks for development. We're also going to be looking at different economic models, okay? You're going to have to know the difference between our three main models. Those models include the free market model. We're going to be looking at the core periphery model, and we're going to be looking at the sustainability models. After that, we're going to look at sustainability, okay, because development without sustainability is not efficient enough, okay? We need to focus our development on and make sure that it occurs in the most sustainable manner. And lastly, we're going to look at community-based development, okay? And especially when we look at our community-based development, we're going to focus on rural and urban development within those communities. So quite a big discussion ahead of us today, and let's begin by looking at our important terminology. Once again, it is one of the most important things that you need to be able to do is to define important words. And the important words that go with the frameworks are the following. Okay, globalization. Globalization is a process that leads to an integrated global economy and society. The key words here being integrated global economy. When we have globalization, they speak about how our borders no longer exist. We're sharing information, we're sharing technology, and all of those things come into the specific topic of globalization. All right, when we refer to factors, okay, we are looking at elements or causes that will contribute to a specific result. So if we look at the factors affecting development, we are looking at factors that are going to contribute to development or cause different results in different forms of development. Okay. One of the things that we look at in terms of our frameworks is we have certain models that development has been based on. And therefore, to understand these models, we need to know what is meant by the word model. And if we look at our definition, it says, a representation of an aspect of the real world, a simplified or generalized version. I think what's important to note, grade 11s, is that with a model, it's not an ideal, perfect situation. And that is why they use the specific words like it's an aspect of the real world. It's simplified and generalized, okay? Which means certain parts you may be able to relate to, other parts you think, oh dear, that's not what we are about, and that is what a model is based upon. In terms of our economy, okay, the economy is the system of production and distribution in a society. It is made up of 4 sectors: our primary sector, secondary, tertiary, and quaternary. Just a reminder that when we deal with the primary sector, we are looking at the extraction of raw material. The secondary sector deals with the processing and manufacturing of those raw goods. The tertiary sector involves the provision of services, and the quaternary sector involves research and technology. And all those sectors combined together form what's called the economy. Okay. All right. Now, the reason why we've got a definition for the word core is because one of the models that we are going to study in our frameworks for development is called the core periphery model. So we need to understand what is meant by this word core to help us get a better understanding of the core periphery model. And if we look at our definition, okay, it says for our core, it's an area which has an economic advantage due to high levels of capital, infrastructure, and employment. It's the most developed part of a city or a country, okay? It doesn't specifically have to be a particular thing. Like I said, different cities can have different cores within those cities. Different countries can have different cores within the country. So it's not specific, but it must have an economic advantage where there are high levels of capital, infrastructure, and employment within that area. All right, the core periphery model, that's one of the models that we are going to be studying in today's lesson. It says it's a model that tries to explain where economic development takes place using the concepts of the core and the periphery. I think a bit later on we look at a definition of the periphery, but just in brief, the periphery refers to the outside or what's surrounding the core. So when we refer to the core and periphery model, we're looking at the center part and anything that is surrounding that center part. Our free market model, also known as the Rostow's model, okay, is a model that tries to explain development purely based on the economy. Okay, and when we look specifically at this model, we'll look at the different stages that this model believes the economy goes through from growth to where it's reached almost its peak level of development. Okay, so there's our definition of the periphery. We have spoken about that. And the periphery is an area lacking capital, so very opposite to the core, okay? It lacks infrastructure and employment opportunities. It is the less developed area. So a nice question that you should already be imagining in your head is give the differences between the core and the periphery. And these words within the definitions are going to help you to do that. All right. Now we look at sustainable development. Sometime or other in your life, in terms of studying geography, you need to study a definition of sustainable development. You can then take that exact same definition, and anytime sustainable development is mentioned, you can apply that definition. So the one that we've got today, it says any development that can sustain themselves long term. Okay, and do not deplete the natural resources of the area. And this is the whole concept of sustainable development, is that all countries need to have development take place, but that development must be in a sustainable manner. So we encourage development, but we're also trying to now encourage that this development takes place sustainably. Therefore, a new addition into the geographical syllabus for this new CAPS has added in the sustainable development model. Previously, we only compared the Rostow model and the core periphery model, but because development has become so focused on being sustainable, they have now added in a sustainable development model. Okay, and that sustainable development model says the following. It says, a model of development that aims to incorporate, let's just get the right pen here. Okay, it aims to incorporate economic and social development without any harm to the environment. Okay, so any country that is looking to move forward in terms of sustainable development needs to start using the sustainable development model, whereby we take economic development, social development of the people, and we keep the environment in mind without harming it in a negative way. Community-based development, okay? What is meant by that? It's a program designed to improve the quality of life within a specific community. So whether that community is an urban community or if it's a rural community, the aim of this program is to improve the quality of life. And that is what is key. Okay, we want to improve people's quality of life so that effective development can occur. Diffusion, okay, the reason why we need to learn the word diffusion, okay, is because we look at the core periphery model, and what in general that model says is that development should diffuse from the center core out to the periphery, and that's why it's important to understand this word. So diffusion, moving from an area of high concentration to an area of lower concentration. All right, our last definition is the multiplier effect, okay, and why this is important, it says the following. It says, an increase in economic activity creates a ripple effect within the economy. Okay, that ripple effect results in increased consumption and an increase to the national income of that country. What they're trying to explain here is that as soon as development gets going within a country, it has a knock-on effect to other stages of development. So a very brief example would be that if a mineral resource was developed, a mining town would develop around that mineral resource, which is what we refer to as the multiplier effect. So a whole lot more services would be needed in order to mine and get that resource out of the ground. Those are all our definitions for this section. It is now time to move on and look at the factors that have affected development. We've got quite a few here. Okay, so we're going to take them one by one and look at the impact that these factors have had on development from basically when the world started to present day development. All right, so the first factors that we're going to look at is what we refer to as our political factors. And one of our most important political factors is history, okay? So in other words, what has happened in the past and how has this impacted the development that takes place today? And our first point is colonization. Now, for those of you who don't take history, colonization refers to when the more economically developed countries go into less economically developed countries and sort of take over and manage their resources and that for them, okay? And take the benefit back to their own country rather than helping the country that the resources actually belong to. So it says colonization led to the extraction of resources by the developed countries. So the developed countries went into the developing world, found what resources they needed, and they had the means and the technology to extract those resources. And this has a huge knock-on effect for development, because for those developing countries to grow and develop, they need to actually be getting their own resources out of the ground and selling them to the developed countries. Our next point, no laws govern the use or exploitation of resources. So when the developed countries went into these developing worlds and decided to extract their mineral resources, those countries were lacking in terms of their policies with regard to how much of the minerals we can take out. And this is now a problem that has led to a decrease in development of those developing countries. Large multinational companies and investors have exploited the natural resources. So it's a very similar point. These large companies go in, they take what they need, and they leave the developing country with nothing. Lastly, labor is exploited, okay? And local labor remains unskilled. That's very important, because the more skilled you are in terms of the career that you do, the more salary and that you can obtain. So if these places remain very unskilled, there's no way that they can develop further in terms of the economy. All right, another factor, okay, that we're going to look at is what we refer to as our social factors and how social factors affect development. Our first important social factor is population growth. Anything that you study within geography is based on population growth. It says the world's population is increasing at a rapid rate, and that is not good news for development. The faster our population grows, so too our development in that will also increase, but it's placing tremendous pressure on our resources. This puts pressure on the resources, it actually says that in the second point, such as our wood, water, and soil. Those are basic needs, okay? A lot of developing countries use wood as their source of fuel. Okay, we all need water to survive, and our soil is important because that's where our food supply comes from. And soil is not easily made. It's basically made by the weathering of the rocks on the Earth's surface, and once we lose our fertile soil in that, to gain fertile soil back takes a very long time. Okay, the resources are becoming depleted or degraded. Okay, in terms of depletion, it means that there will no longer be any more of those resources. The word degraded means that the quality and the quantity of those resources is decreasing. Education and training are also social factors. Okay, and it says an educated labor force is essential for the transfer of technology from developed and developing countries. Okay, so in other words, we need to be educated. It's one of the basic needs that encourages development to occur. High illiteracy rates hamper educational process in a country. And for starters, most countries should be spending a large amount of their money on actually improving the literacy rates within a country. Moving on, our economic factors affecting development. Trade imbalances, okay? Globalization has made it easy for trade and the exchange of goods. Like I mentioned before, in terms of globalization, our borders have disappeared. Most countries are able to trade with one another as long as no sanctions have been imposed. A sanction is where one country says, I will not trade with a particular country. Okay. World Trade Organizations has introduced a free market trade system in an effort to attempt to integrate developing countries into the world's trading and economic systems, which means basically that any country can trade with another country and it's at no cost to the country. All right? Developing countries often have to export to developed countries and suffer when their orders are cut back. So these developing countries are exporting their raw materials to the developed world. But as soon as the developed country can obtain the same resource at a much lower rate from another country, they automatically stop their orders. And this impacts those developing countries very, very badly. All right, energy. More than half of the world's population does not have access to clean and cheap energy. We are lucky in South Africa that we actually have one of the most effective and cheap forms of electricity. Okay, a lot of other countries around the world pay large amounts for the supply of electricity to their homes. The high use of biomass fuel. Okay, maybe you don't understand what biomass fuel is. Biomass fuel is using waste products in order to generate heat. It says the high use of biomass fuel in developing countries means a lack of energy. Okay, so in other words, they might be able to use it in order to heat their homes, but it takes a lot to keep that heat running for long periods of time. Energy slows down development, okay? Your industries cannot function if they don't have an electricity supply. Developed countries contribute to the rising levels of CO2, okay? And this is due to the burning of fossil fuels. Right. Natural resources, still under the heading of factors affecting development. The carrying capacity, okay, and you will notice in brackets, I've given a definition of carrying capacity. It's the maximum population that resources in a given environment can support. And what we find is happening is that the carrying capacity due to development is being exceeded, and therefore those resources cannot cope with the amount of development and population growth that is taking place. Large populations, okay, are putting a massive amount of pressure on these natural resources. Environmental degradation. There is a lack of environmental education. It's only been for the last 20 years where the world has stood up and said we actually need to do something about the sustainability of the world, educating people on how to effectively manage the world and its resources. There's very little government policy and effective pollution control that has been put in place to try and start saving our world. There's an objective of profit at all costs, which means basically let's use the resources, let's get rid of everything that we have because money is the most important thing. The access to the resources. Different countries have an uneven distribution. South Africa as a country, we are very wealthy in terms of our mineral deposits. We have large quantities of uranium, which is going to be effective in about 20 to 30 years when nuclear energy becomes important. But a lot of countries, and these are some very highly developed countries, have a severe lack in terms of the resources that they have access to. And therefore, they need to import or find a developing country where they can go in and take those resources from them. Developed countries need more resources than developing countries, okay? That's purely because they have the skills and technology to know what to do with those resources. Developing countries unfortunately have a lot of unskilled labor which cannot effectively process those raw goods and turn them into something for a higher profit. There's a lack of access to water, electricity and sanitation in our developing countries. That goes hand in hand with development. Land ownership is prevented in some countries owing to that specific country's view on who should own the land. There's a lack of opportunity in business owing to government policies. So what you find in a lot of the developing countries is the government basically takes control of all the mineral resources, and therefore the opportunities for other businesses in that to grow is limited because the government is mainly in control. All right. We now need to look at the specific models of economic development. We have three, okay? And the first model that we're going to look at is what we call Rostow's model. It's also referred to as the free market model, okay? And what's specifically important about this model is it shows that economic development takes place in 5 different stages. So we have 2 different graphs, and if you have different textbooks on that, you will see that these models are identical, they're just represented in different ways. So if we look at the model on the screen now, what you will see is that on the bottom axis over here, which is what we call our x-axis, we are depicting the movement of time, okay? So time from when the economy starts to current day time. And on the y-axis, we are depicting the level of development. So if we start at the bottom or the beginning of Rostow's model, and the information is a bit later on, but we're just going to go through it briefly. Stage 1 refers to the traditional society. Now, what that means is that most countries begin with an economy that is based on agriculture. Okay, and as time develops, the agriculture goes from being subsistence agriculture to becoming commercial agriculture. And even that change from subsistence to commercial agriculture shows improvement in terms of the country's development. Stage 2 speaks about the transitional stage, preconditions for takeoff. There we're looking at how the commercial farming has taken place, maybe sending some more stuff off to industries. And then stage 3 takes over, which is called the takeoff. At stage 3 over here, that is where our industrialization comes into play. Okay? And we've spoken about it a few times, all right, in other units that we have done previously. But when a country starts to go through industrialization, that country's development is really starting to take off. And that's why it's related to stage 3, which is called the takeoff stage. By stage 4, drive to maturity, you've got most of the country involved in industrialization, service provision. And then the last stage is called the high mass consumption stage. The here the country has reached one of the highest levels of development, and as you can see, it has taken a very long period of time. Underneath this picture, we just have another diagram explaining the Rostow's model again. Like I said, all different textbooks and that will have different images for Rostow's model. So here it gives a bit more information in terms of what is meant by each stage. If we look at stage 1, it says subsistence, bartering, agriculture. If I barter, okay, what it means to barter is I will give you 2 tomatoes and you give me 2 cucumbers in return. That's what's bartering. It's an exchange of goods where both parties have equal sort of representation in that deal. Stage 2, transitional stage, specialization, surpluses, infrastructure. The surpluses imply commercial farming, which is what I mentioned earlier. Stage 3, takeoff, industrialization, growing investment, regional growth, political changes. Stage 4, diversification, innovation, less reliance on imports. Okay, so in other words, these countries are now producing valuable goods within their own country and they have no need to bring in goods from another country. Stage 5, consumer orientated, durable goods, service sector flourishes and becomes the dominant sector, which is our tertiary and quaternary sector, which dominates developed countries. All right. Underneath this, we can now see we've got a bit of information based on the different stages of the Rostow's model. Okay, so it says Rostow's model is a modern model. Okay, so like I said before, when we look at the definitions, models are not perfect. They are there to try and get an idea as to why society has done what it has done. It has purely been based on economic development. So they don't look at social development, they don't look at demographic development, they're purely basing development in terms of the economy. So as long as your economy is doing better, they believe your country should be doing better. Development took place over time as a result of free trade, industrialization, and exports. Okay, so we could, the country could trade with the rest of the world. Industrialization took off, whereby they were manufacturing and processing their own goods, and therefore became exporters to the rest of the world and obtained a lot more money for those exports. It includes 5 main stages. So once again, these are the 5 stages that I have discussed when we went through the diagrams. Traditional society, all societies begin underdeveloped, okay? We've mentioned that they focus on subsistence agriculture, okay? There's little technology in those societies, and a balance occurs between the population and the resources. They have no need or no want to actually try and be better. Preconditions for takeoff: formal economy starts to grow. Commercial agriculture, which we mentioned, takes over. Technology and infrastructure start to improve. If you are going to be performing commercial agriculture, you need to improve your infrastructure. How do you plan on taking the goods from the farm to the rest of the world? And therefore your infrastructure becomes a whole lot better. Our exports become higher. Okay, we are exporting goods that have now been processed. Takeoff, industries develop, sustained economic growth, okay, and that means that our economy starts to get a lot stronger. The drive to maturity, our economic growth has spread through the country, so it starts off in a small region and it starts to spread down through the rest of the countries. Industrialization, once again, and we now have urbanization, where more and more people start to live in the cities and the towns. High mass consumption, highly developed, advanced industrial economy, and our tertiary sector starts to grow. And in terms of that now, because we know that our sectors have developed, we can also add in here that the quaternary sector will predominantly start to grow as well. Okay? With any model in geography, there's going to be criticisms of that model. So in other words, they have this idealistic world and then they say, well, it's too idealistic and these are the reasons why. So with our criticisms, it says the model was mainly based on European countries. And that's a serious problem, because if we look at the developing world, most of the developing world is lying south of the equator, okay, the majority of it. There was little relevance for our developing countries. In other words, to go from subsistence agriculture to commercial farming, you need highly trained, highly skilled people. And if the developing countries don't have that knowledge and education, they're going to remain as subsistence farmers. Many countries remained in stage 1, okay, which is our traditional society, despite money and time. Without actually teaching the people to become more effective themselves, no matter how much money or time you put into an effort, it's not going to be helpful. The focus was on economic growth only, and that's probably the biggest criticism of the Rostow model, is that it purely focused development in terms of the economy. So if your economy was doing well, you were developed. Right. Okay. Our next model, it's a much simpler model, okay, is what we refer to as the core periphery model. And if you just look at the diagram on screen, it's quite a simplistic sort of idea. And the idea surrounding the core periphery model is that most places were made up of a central business district, all right, where we have a concentration of services, investment, a lot of jobs and wealth located in that core area. And this is what would be referred to as the core, okay? So we've spoken about the core, okay, and this, remember, is the core periphery model. And if you look away from the core, it says levels of wealth, development, and standards of living decrease with distance from the core. And this area coming out in all different directions is what's referred to as the periphery. Okay, and I've said to you before, please note you will have to probably give the difference between the core and the periphery, and for that you can use your definitions. All right, underneath it says, economic growth is mainly concentrated in the core, okay? The periphery is very dependent on the core. Over time, development should spread from the core out to the periphery, and in this way, the whole area would become developed. So this was their idea, that the development was found within that core, and over time the development would generally spread out to the peripheral areas. The core periphery model can be applied at different scales. In other words, it could be at a local scale, it could be at a global scale, it could be at a regional scale. So, for example, in South Africa, Johannesburg could have different core areas, Randburg, Sandton, Fourways, and they would then spread that development to the rest of Johannesburg. Alternatively, you could view Johannesburg as one of the core areas within South Africa. Cape Town could be another core area, and or you could look at South Africa being the core area for the rest of Africa. So that's what's quite nice about this model, is that it's not restricted to a specific local area, okay? It has relevance towards the global world as well. All right. The sustainable development models, like I said, these are new, okay? They've been newly introduced, and that is because the world is focusing on sustainable development. If we just look at the model, you can see that the sustainable development model takes into account 3 different areas. We look at, and I just want to highlight for you so that you can see, we look at the society, okay? We look at the economy, and very important, we include the environment. So not only we look at the people as well as the economy, we're now taking all 3 into consideration and making sure that all 3 can work effectively together. In terms of society, we're looking at equity, health, culture and history, accessibility, involvement, livability, values. Under economy, productivity, employment, business development, tax burdens, trade. And under the environment, pollution, habitat preservation, biodiversity, air and water quality, and aesthetics. Okay, so what you can get from this is that all 3 need to work in or work together in order for the sustainable development model to work. Below, I just have another representation of the sustainable development model, and why I think this one's quite important, and maybe just think a little bit out the box here. But you can see that the economy is represented by a very small blue circle. And more important than the economy, okay, by a slightly larger red circle, is the society. And going back on previous discussions, your population of your country needs to be looked after in order for economic development to take place. So in terms of this model, it is portraying that importance of the society as opposed to the economy of that country. And then most important, you can tell by the bigger circle, is the environment, okay? And that is what's bringing everything together, because basically without the environment, economic development will not happen, nor will the population development occur. All right, so in terms of our notes for the Sustainable Development Model, it says it's the newest type. So even though Rostow's model is a very modern model, the Sustainable Development Model is the most effective type, okay, and the newest type. They focus on economic, social, and environmental elements in terms of development. It is focuses on the well-being, justice, human resources, and environmental sustainability. Sustainable development can only occur if a balance exists between these three main components. All right. Community-based development, okay? So in other words, we've looked at models that are laid down in terms of this is how development takes place around the world, and now we need to localize our development strategies and look at community-based development. In terms of community-based development, it says there are programs that have been designed to improve the quality of life within specific communities, okay? They take into account local conditions, culture, and history. By involving the community in the planning, execution, and ongoing maintenance of the program, the people are more likely to be involved. So what this community-based program is trying to say is that when we need development to take place, we need to get the community's buy-in so that the development would be sustainable and the people themselves actually become responsible for looking after the development. Community-based development can be divided into rural development as well as urban development. There are different needs for rural populations, and urban populations have their own set of different needs. All right, it is time for us now to go to a commercial break. Okay, after the break, we will be looking at questions that deal with all the information that you've studied. So we'll be looking at the economic models. We will be looking at the important definitions again. Join us after the break. Welcome back after that short ad break. We are now going to be looking at questions that are based on our topic for today, which is frameworks for development. Our first question, question 1, says the following. It says, complete the table below by filling in the missing spaces. And essentially what they are trying to get you to do here is to compare our three models of development. So we're going to compare Rostow's model, the core periphery model, and the sustainability model in terms of the main idea of how development takes place. We're going to look at one strength of each of the models. We're going to look at one weakness of each of the models. And we're going to briefly try and apply each of these models to the South African context. All right, we're also going to look, as a part of this development issues, how each of these models is specifically relating to South Africa. What I suggest we do is we go and we look at how each specific issue applies to each one of the models, and then we will move down from there. So our first thing we're going to look at is how development takes place within each of the specific models. And our first model is the Rostow's model, or what's better known as the free market model. And what it says in this specific model is that countries pass through stages, and I think that's the key here, is that the Rostow's model is based on the 5 different stages of development. And it says, as they follow the path of economic development, westernization, and modernization. So Rostow's model is based on stages and how each of the countries will progress through these different stages as they move towards ultimate development. Our core periphery model, okay, it says, let's get a different color. Economic growth spreads from the core to the surrounding periphery. Okay. Over time, the entire region is believed to become more developed. So it's very different ideas to the Rostow's model, and what you should be comparing is how each of them are differing. Okay. Our sustainability model is a bit longer. Okay. It says development needs to meet the needs of the present without compromising the needs of future generations. And that's pretty much the definition of sustainable development. Okay, it involves the economy, the society, and the environment. So that's its key features there, is that it takes all those different aspects into account. So if you just look at the different models again, we've got Rostow's model, which is based on our stages, okay, and that each country will pass through these different development levels. Core periphery models is based on a core, and that the development will spread out eventually to the periphery. And the sustainability model involves the economy, the society, and the environment, and all those 3 parts working together. If we go and look at the strengths of each of the models. So in other words, what was good about the development of those models? In terms of Rostow's model, okay, it says modern developed Western economies have gone through the 5 stages. Okay, emphasis was on the economics of the country, and it tries to explain how the countries become developed over time. Okay, so it's not saying that development happens overnight, that development is a time process and it takes a long period of time to get there, setting the scene for other countries to follow. So in other words, other countries can look at how a specific country took off and follow in their same path. In terms of the core periphery model, it says this model can be applied at different scales, and that's one of its most important characteristics. Okay, those different scales we spoke about when we discussed it. It can occur at the local scale, the regional, or the national, or even the global scale. There can be more than one core area. Okay, most countries have dominant core areas where economic growth and development is concentrated. So like our core areas in South Africa would be Cape Town, Durban, Johannesburg. In terms of the sustainability model, it says development needs to be sustainable and environmentally friendly, a holistic, integrated that incorporates people, the economy, and the environment. So this one's quite set on sticking to those basics of how the economy, the society, and the environment need to all work together. And those are the specific strengths of each of the 3 models. In terms of the weaknesses, okay, the main weakness that was with Rostow's model is that it was purely based on economic development. So it says, based on Western capitalist theory, not all countries pass through the 5 stages, and there are other paths of development. So what they're saying is that not all countries need to follow stage 1, stage 2, stage 3. Depending on how fast the development happens, maybe you can jump from stage 1 to stage 3. The development also only focused on the economic growth and did not mention social and human development. And that was the main criticism of Rostow's model, is that everything was based on economics and not enough on social and human development. With the core periphery model, okay, basically here, the main objections, it says sometimes the core area develops intensely and development does not spread out, okay? And that was the main criticism here, is that there's no reason that that development and growth should spread. If it's contained within that core and it's working well, then it's not going to spread out to those peripheral areas. It says sometimes a core area can cease developing and the surrounding area will then collapse from this point of view. So if for some reason there is major issues within that core, it's going to lead to a lack of development pushing out to the periphery as well. The criticism for the sustainability model, okay, it says many development projects, let's just get the pen here, disregard the environment in favor of economic gain and profits. And that's the biggest problem, is that you've got to get the countries buy-in to this model, because the economy and the profits that they gain are much more important to them. The society is not always consulted. The model is idealistic, and in the approach, the idea is not very feasible. Like I said, if the countries do not buy into this idea of this particular model, it is not going to be worthwhile that countries follow this model. All right, then our last factor that we need to look at in our table is to briefly apply each of the specific models to South Africa. So, the Rostow model, it says, many years ago, South Africa was in stage 1. The discovery of minerals led to stage 2. So when we discovered gold and diamonds, we went from a society that was based on agriculture into a more industrial society. Between 1940 and 1970, they could consider that to be stage 3, where our economy started to get a lot stronger. One could say that South Africa is now in stage 4, progressing towards stage 5. In terms of the core periphery model, Gauteng is South Africa's dominant core. Okay, that is where the economic hub of South Africa is found. To an extent, the rest of the country depends on this single core region. Cape Town and Durban can also be considered core regions with their own surrounding peripheries. But in terms of the core areas, those are probably the 3 main and most important ones. If we look at the sustainability model, it says new developments require EIAs. EIAs are environmental impact assessments, and that is something that's become very important in South Africa. For any new development to take place, an environmental impact assessment must be done before the go-ahead to that development is given. These assessments take into account the economy, the environment, as well as the society. And that's the point of doing an environmental impact assessment. And those environmental impact assessments are pretty much part of the law now within South Africa, and in terms of any development that is taking place. Quite a long, complicated question. I think you just need to summarize it a bit and put into context the most important parts, but it is generally a relatively easy section. All right, if we move on to question 2. Question 2 is a bit more difficult, okay? And the reason why I say that is that in geography you are expected to answer paragraph type questions. And what I suggest is that before you start writing your paragraph, you write down some ideas that could be useful when answering your paragraph, and highlight key words within the question to make sure that your answer covers each one of the specific things that has been asked. So if we read the question together, it says, explain how education and training, okay, so that's what they want you to do. They want you to use education and training, play an important role in developing the economy. Okay, you should explain how having an educated and trained workforce might influence other aspects of the economy. Those aspects include access to resources, energy supplies, markets, environmental degradation, water, and transport systems. So what they basically are asking you to do within this question is say how an educated and trained workforce is is going to make each of these other sections much better. And if they're made better, then development can take place within that country. So if we look at the first one, which is access to resources, and you keep in mind, now my population is educated and they're trained. How is that, okay, going to influence the access to resources? And the way it's going to influence us and overall influence development is as follows. The more educated people are, the more means they have in order to extract those resources wisely. They then also can process and manufacture those resources so that they can be exported for a larger profit. And in terms of that, it's going to be beneficial towards your economy. If we look at energy supplies, the more trained and educated our population is, the more effective our energy supplies are going to be. They're going to come up with new ideas of using alternative energies, okay? They're going to conserve the energy resources that they have purely because they've been educated and trained that this is how our economy needs to go forward. Our markets, okay, the more educated and trained your population is, the greater your market is going to do. So when you have an educated and trained workforce, you are going to be exporting goods that are going to get a higher value from the rest of the world. The less skilled your workforce is, you are going to be exporting raw materials, which is not going to gain a huge amount of money. Environmental degradation. If your population is educated and trained, the amount of environmental degradation will become less as well. They know how they, or what cause and effect they're going to have on the environment, and they can put in place policies and uphold those policies to prevent the environmental degradation. In terms of water, the more educated and trained you are, okay, you're going to get water supplies into that country. So if it's a country that is lacking in water resources, educated and trained people will come up with water transfer schemes, thereby bringing in water, especially in terms of industrial use. Industries use a lot of water, and we need these educated and skilled people to bring in that knowledge. Lastly, our transport systems. The more educated and skilled people are, there's kind of two angles here. There'd be less pollution, okay, because they know that the effects that carpooling and that would have on decreasing pollution within the environment. We can also look at upgrading the infrastructure if your people are trained and skilled. So that is kind of how you should be thinking when you need to answer a paragraph question. And what you would then do is write down all those thoughts, okay, and then put them together in free-flowing sentences that would make that question and that answer more relevant to you. All right, question 3. It says, use the information in the table below to answer the questions. We've been given two countries. We've got Japan and we have the Republic of Congo. Just from what we know in terms of development, one can assume that Japan is a developed country and the Republic of Congo is a developing country. If we look at the resources, the trade, education and training, population growth, energy and environmental degradation. So they are comparing these two countries according to a list of criteria. And the information is given in the table. We then need to use that information to answer the questions that have been posed to us. So the first question is, in which area does the Republic of Congo have an advantage over Japan? And so we need to go back to our table. And in terms of the first set of information, that is like basic indicator information. So it's giving us the GDP per capita, the HDI, the Gini coefficients, and really, yes, we can see that there's a difference in that information, but it's purely based on developed versus a developing country. What's important to look at is the information under resources. If we look at Japan, it says it has very few natural resources, and this is probably going to be the answer that they're looking for. However, they've got a highly skilled labor force, okay, and high levels of technology. If you look at the Republic of Congo, they've got a whole list of resources that are available in that country. And being a developed country, they certainly are not going to have the highly skilled labor force that Japan has, or the high levels of technology. So if we go back to the question, in which area does the Republic of Congo have an advantage over Japan? It's in the amount of resources. Republic of Congo has certainly got more resources at their disposal as opposed to Japan. Second question. What do the exports and imports of the Republic of Congo tell us about the level of industrialization in this country? So once again, we need to go back to our table. Okay. And in our table, go to the exports and imports, which would be found under the heading of trade. And if we go to the Republic of Congo, it says exports, okay, 9 billion, petroleum, lumber, plywood, sugar. And imports, where do we see imports? Okay, imports, sorry, 3 million. We're importing machinery, vehicles. In other words, they're exporting goods in the raw material phase, and they're importing much higher quality goods. So if we go back to the question, it says, what do the exports and imports of the Republic of Congo tell us about the level of industrialization? It tells us that the level of industrialization is extremely low. The reason it's extremely low is because they are exporting unprocessed goods. Okay, so that's the key word here. Unprocessed goods, okay? And therefore they get a low income for those goods. Right. What do the environmental issues experienced by the Republic of Congo tell us about its overall level of development? So we need to go back to our table and look at environmental issues. Okay, which there's a section of it. And if we look at the Republic of Congo, it says electricity consumption, 164th in the world. Environmental issues. This is what we need to pick up on. Deforestation, water pollution, and pollution from vehicles. So those are the environmental problems that they are battling with. And if we go back to our question, it says, what do the environmental issues experienced by Congo tell us about development? Their issues are deforestation, water pollution, air pollution. When a country is experiencing deforestation, it's because they are not effectively using a sustainable method. All right, so question 3 says, what do the environmental issues experienced by the Republic of Congo tell us about its overall level of development? And if we go back to the table, we will see that if we go to environmental issues, right at the bottom, the main issues experienced in the Republic of Congo is deforestation, water pollution, as well as air pollution. So if we go back to the question, we just missed it there, we know that deforestation is happening at an alarming rate, and the only reason a country undergoes deforestation is, number one, because they need that space because their population is growing too fast, or alternatively they are using that wood as their only means of fuel. And so in terms of the level of development in a country that's experiencing deforestation, it's showing a very low level of development. Water pollution and air pollution, in terms of the air pollution, they don't obviously have a lot of public transport in place. They don't know that we need to cut down on the amount of emissions. And that once again relates to a very low level of development. With the water pollution, it's said in the table that it comes from raw sewage. That possibly implies that the infrastructure is not up to scratch and that it's been very poorly designed. And that is indicative of a developing country. So in terms of looking at those environmental problems, we can then see why the Republic of Congo is such a developing country. If we look at question 3.4, it says, how is Japan's economic success negatively impacting the environment? So once again, if we go back to our table and we look at Japan and under energy and environmental degradation, we will see that negative environmental effects include air pollution, acid rain, and decreased water quality. Okay, and when we go back to the question, we are looking at how Japan's economic success is negatively impacting the environment. The more industrial growth that you have within a country, the greater amount of air pollution you are going to incur for your country. And because Japan has become so focused on industries and growing in terms of its development, they're not taking into account the amount of air pollution that is taking place. In terms of the acid rain that is occurring because of this, once again, that acid rain is forming because of chemicals in that are coming out of industrial plants. So we can see that it's all pretty much due to the industrial activity that Japan is impacting the environment in a great way. And when we go back to the question, how's its economic success impacting the environment? Economic success is based because we're becoming industrialized. And that industrialization has caused pollution of that environment in various forms. All right, question 3.5. Explain how the population growth rate in each country could become a negative factor for development. Now, this is quite a different question because we are looking at Japan, okay, and we're looking at the Republic of Congo. We've already discussed that Japan is more of a developed country, okay, and the Republic of Congo is a developing country. Now, in terms of population growth rate, and it says it could become a negative factor, there's two different answers that we need to look at based on the two different types of the country. Two different types of countries. So we're looking at Japan, which is a developed country. And if the population growth rates, if it continues, the way in which it's going to become a negative factor of development is basically they're going to put even more harm or occur more harm to the environment. All right. In terms of more and more people being born, they're going to further use their resources, they're going to increase their industrialization, and this will have negative effects on their development. If we look at the Republic of Congo, and if we have population growth rate in that country, which more than likely we will have quite a bit of, it becomes negative in terms of their development because it's going to put their economy under strain. They're going to try and be looking after this growing population rather than focusing on economic development. So for both of the countries, population growth rate will seriously harm the amount of development levels within those two countries, but just from different points of view. All right, then it says, what lessons could the Republic of Congo learn from Japan in order to increase its level of development? Now, Japan is one of those countries that just literally started to grow in terms of industrialization. So what the question is looking at here is, for example, what can the Republic of Congo use from Japan's increased level of development in order to get their country along the same path? And to answer this question, I think it's important that we go back to the table and we look for some of the answers in there. So if, for example, we look at resources, it mentioned for Japan that they have a very highly skilled labor force, and therefore it's going to be important for the Republic of Congo to increase the skills and the training of their own population. And some other indicators that are given in our table is we've actually got the heading education and training. And if you compare the two countries to each other, you will notice that Japan's, spend a majority of their life, 15 whole years, being schooled, whereas people in the Republic of Congo have a maximum amount of schooling of 10 years. The contribution of the GDP to education in Japan is much greater amount compared to the contribution to education in the Republic of Congo. So if we look at figures like that, we can see that the Republic of Congo should take these ideas from Japan. In other words, increase the amount of money spent or increase the amount of money of your GDP on education and training to create a highly skilled workforce. That is going to increase the level of development of your country. In terms of other things such as, your literacy rates, if we use a lot of money to increase the literacy of the people in the Republic of Congo, they once again can become a highly skilled labor force. So it's very important that when you are going through questions and you kind of come to a stumbling block and think, well, I don't actually know, how am I going to answer this question? Go back to the table, try and identify valuable pieces of information from it. I often find that a lot of the answers sit in front of children and they just cannot read and get the information from the resources that they are given. I hope you've enjoyed this section on the frameworks for development. Just a reminder to please learn your definitions, try and make a summary of the framework, the models that we have learned today. So the Rostow's model, core periphery model, sustainable development model. The first question was quite a nice one in terms of summarizing those three models, their advantages, the disadvantages, and just keep doing the basics. And when you answer questions, make sure you know what is being asked to you in the first place. I'd like to thank you for joining us today, and we hope that you will join us for the next couple of lessons on development as well. That this model believes the economy goes through from growth to where it's reached almost its peak level of development. Okay, so there's our definition of the periphery. We have spoken about that. And the periphery is an area lacking capital, so very opposite to the core, okay? It lacks infrastructure and employment opportunities. It is the less developed area. So a nice question that you should already be imagining in your head is give the differences between the core and the periphery. And these words within the definitions are going to help you to do that. All right. Now we look at sustainable development. Sometime or other in your life, in terms of studying geography, you need to study a definition of sustainable development. You can then take that exact same definition, and anytime sustainable development is mentioned, you can apply that definition. So the one that we've got today, it says any development that can sustain themselves long term. Okay, and do not deplete the natural resources of the area. And this is the whole concept of sustainable development, is that all countries need to have development take place, but that development must be in a sustainable manner. So we encourage development, but we're also trying to now encourage that this development takes place sustainably. Therefore, a new addition into the geographical syllabus for this new CAPS has added in the sustainable development model. Previously, where mobility is not efficient enough, okay, we need to focus our development on and make sure that it occurs in the most sustainable manner. And lastly, we're going to look at community-based development, okay? And especially when we look at our community-based development, we're going to focus on rural and urban development within those communities. So quite a big discussion ahead of us today, and let's begin by looking at our important terminology. Once again, it is one of the most important things that you need to be able to do is to define important words. And the important words that go with the frameworks are the following. Okay, globalization. Globalization is a process that leads to an integrated global economy and society. The key words here being integrated global economy. When we have globalization, they speak about how our borders no longer exist, we're sharing information, we're sharing technology, and all of those things come into the specific topic of globalization. All right, when we refer to factors, okay, we are looking at elements or causes that will contribute to a specific result. So if we look at the factors affecting development, we are looking at factors that are going to contribute to development or cause different results in different forms of development. Okay. One of the things that we look at in terms of our frameworks is we have certain models that development has been based on, and therefore Good day. We are watching Learn Extra Lessons for Grade 11, and today's topic that we'll be discussing is frameworks for development. We will be going through key concepts, important definitions, and explanations that you need to know in terms of this section, and we will also look at different questions that you can expect to find and how to answer those specific questions. So if we start today, we look at our key concepts. And our key concepts are things like the following. Okay, so it says, what factors affect development? We're looking at this particular topic, and we look at things such as access to resources, the energy, history, trade imbalances, okay, population growth, education and training, natural resource limitations, and environmental degradation. So as you can see, there's a lot of topics that we are going to be discussing in terms of the frameworks for development. We're also going to be looking at different economic models, okay? You're going to have to know the difference between our three main models. Those models include the free market model. We're going to be looking at the core periphery model, and we're going to be looking at the sustainability models. After that, we're going to look at sustainability, okay, because development without sustainable core to help us get a better understanding of the core periphery model. And if we look at our definition, okay, it says for our core, it's an area which has an economic advantage due to high levels of capital, infrastructure, and employment. It's the most developed part of a city or a country, okay? It doesn't specifically have to be a particular thing. Like I said, different cities can have different cores within those cities. Different countries can have different cores within the country. So it's not specific, but it must have an economic advantage where there are high levels of capital, infrastructure, and employment within that area. All right, the core periphery model, that's one of the models that we are going to be studying in today's lesson. It says it's a model that tries to explain where economic development takes place using the concepts of the core and the periphery. I think a bit later on we look at a definition of the periphery, but just in brief, the periphery refers to the outside or what's surrounding the core. So when we refer to the core and periphery model, we're looking at the center part and anything that is surrounding that center part. Our free market model, also known as the Rostow's model, okay, is a model that tries to explain development purely based on the economy. Okay, and when we look specifically at this model, we'll look at the different stages. To understand these models, we need to know what is meant by the word model. And if we look at our definition, it says a representation of an aspect of the real world, a simplified or generalized version. I think what's important to note, grade 11s, is that with a model, it's not an ideal, perfect situation. And that is why they use the specific words like it's an aspect of the real world. It's simplified and generalized, okay? Which means certain parts you may be able to relate to, other parts you think, oh dear, that's not what we are about, and that is what a model is based upon. In terms of our economy, okay, the economy is the system of production and distribution in a society. It is made up of 4 sectors: our primary sector, secondary, tertiary, and quaternary. Just a reminder that when we deal with the primary sector, we are looking at the extraction of raw material. The secondary sector deals with the processing and manufacturing of those raw goods. The tertiary sector involves the provision of services, and the quaternary sector involves research and technology. And all those sectors combined together form what's called the economy. Okay. All right. Now, the reason why we've got a definition for the word core is because one of the models that we are going to study in our frameworks for development is called the core periphery model. So we need to understand what is meant by this word